Good morning. Welcome to our class again together. I'm glad that you have joined me today. We are in John chapter 10. We're going to look at a topic we kind of know something about, probably not as much as we think, and it's going to guide us into a single question, which is, who do you follow? And that's the big question of the day. So, as we get into John chapter 10, let me ask you this question. Have you ever seen or done, or as a child, played follow the leader? You know the game. The game's not that hard. What will happen is a child becomes the leader. He's named the leader, and so everywhere he goes or whatever he does, you have to follow them. Now, that can be very difficult sometimes. Sometimes you get a rambunctious kid who wants to lead you through mud puddles and bramble bushes and over rocks, things that are hard, just to see if you'll follow him, see if he can win the game. But it does make a difference who you follow for this reason. You may not want to go where they take you. I like the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The Pied Piper had this magical charm, in a sense, in which when he played his pipe, anything would follow him. And so one of the things that town fathers did was they hired him to get rid of the rat infestation. So he piped away, the rats lined up, he led them out of town to where they were no longer a nuisance. When he went back into town to claim his pay, they had reneged and decided not to pay him. So in revenge, he picked up his pipe and began to play, and he soon took their children away from them as hostages until he was paid. You see, just because someone can lead you somewhere doesn't mean you need to follow them. That was the problem in Judaism. That's the problem today. When it comes to our spiritual lives, who is worthy of us following them? And I'm not even talking about a human being. I'm talking about ideas sometimes. You know, we live in a world today that says, follow me. Do as the crowd does. Do as the latest trend is. Follow whatever is on the latest TikTok fad or whatever it is. And yet you have to evaluate that. And so in John chapter 10, we are presented with a portrait of what that means and how to evaluate it. So let's jump in. I want to talk, first of all, let's deal with the analogy that Jesus presents. Jesus presents an analogy. It's a figure, is what it says in verse 6. It's a figure that was not understood by the people, why he was telling that and what did he mean by it. It wasn't that the figure was not known to them, it was. But let's first of all start there. John chapter 10, verse 1. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them out all on his own, he goes on before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of the stranger. Now that's an interesting little analogy. But here's the question I want you to answer about yourself. Who are you in the story? Now we would like to see ourselves in several ways. We know we're not the shepherd. We believe we're not the thief or the hireling. We believe we're not the stranger, so that leaves one simple idea, and that is we have to be the sheep. Just a note about sheep and shepherds. When Vicki and I were in our first full-time work, we lived out in the middle of nowhere, it seemed like, next to a church building. It was in the middle of nowhere as well. And one of the things we did, and perhaps the serendipity of living in a terrible place at a terrible time, was that we were surrounded on two sides by sheep pastures full of sheep. So I got to know sheep pretty well. Sheep are not exactly the smartest animals. They keep their head down. They can literally eat themselves over a cliff. And because they eat all the way down to the root, and so they can kill off the grass on a piece of property very quickly. And so the shepherd would come and he would move them from pasture to pasture so that grass would grow back and they'd have something to eat. But if he didn't come, they didn't know what to do. Now, let me ask you something about that. Do you like to be called a sheep? We've kind of turned that into a slur in a sense. Oh, you're nothing but a sheep. Bah. Well, the truth be told, we're all sheep. I remember I had a member in one of my former congregations who objected to be being called a sheep. He said, that's insulting to be called a sheep. I am not a sheep. And I thought to myself, if you only knew what your true character looks like, you would have to say, I am a sheep. He was. And it was a difficulty that he would not admit to. But the other part of this is shepherds. Shepherds, very common in the ancient world. Shepherds they would be hired to take care of sheep. Sheep were a hot commodity. That was the crop. Now, they did not raise sheep to slaughter them and eat them. That was reserved for sacrifice. They did raise them for the wool that they produced. They were a cash crop, if you will. They kept reproducing, and so you kept the flock longer and longer, and it would produce more and more and more. And that was good. That means somebody had to take care of those sheep. And so shepherds were the ones that came along. Many times they were family members. They had grown up in a family, and it was passed from father to son. Sometimes they were hired. And someone would come along and they said, would you be the shepherd of the sheep? And he would be hired for that reason. But it also became a metaphor for leadership. For instance, in Psalm 23 and other places in Psalms, God himself is called a shepherd. And on top of that, there are the kings, and many times they are called shepherds. Prophets are called shepherds. The religious leaders of the day, whether they be Pharisees or high priests, they were called shepherds as well. So when you apply the term shepherd, it hits a lot of different targets. So when Jesus is talking about shepherds, he has various things in mind that I think as we go through the lesson, you'll understand more about what some of the nuances of that word really mean. But let's start with a basic question as we look at this whole passage. So if you turn to John chapter 10, we're not going to read everything, but we will reference various pieces, and so you can keep up that way. First of all, the question is, who are the black hats in this story? Who are the bad guys? Now, when I was a boy, the big Western was a black and white called The Lone Ranger. Now, if you're of a certain age, you know about Clayton Moore riding Silver, saying, "Hi ho, Silver, away." It was something that you watched every week. It was just average and ordinary, along with his sidekick Tonto. And it's one of those cases it helped define a certain concept. The concept it defined was who was good and who wasn't. The Lone Ranger wore a white hat. All the bad guys were black hats. So without ever having to identify this is a bad guy, if they had a black hat on, you knew that they were a bad guy. So the question for this part of the lesson is, who are the black hats in this story? Who are the people that seem to be the bad guys? As Jesus tells about shepherds and the sheep. Well, there are some. There are many, in fact. Three. First of all, there's a thief and a robber. He begins there at the very beginning of this chapter. Says the man who climbs in by another way rather than the door, that man is a thief and a robber. He's there for maliciousness. You see, one of the things that Jesus says, he goes on to say in verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. The thief has no care for the sheep. He cares about himself, what he can get. Many times a thief would steal sheep, they would sell them to someone else. Many times they would start a flock of their own out of somebody else's sheep by stealing them. It is a well-known fact that thieves would take sheep all the time. Some were even shepherds, or at least pretend to be shepherds, that they would come back to the master and say, I don't know what happened to the sheep. Apparently a wolf or a bear has gotten them. So much so that the law prescribed something. It said if you claim that you came back without the sheep and that they were killed and so you don't have them, you have to produce evidence. In Amos chapter 3 and verse 12, there's this little reference there that tells us what the practice of the day was, even though Amos applies it to somebody else. He says, as the shepherd rescues from the mouth of the lion 2 legs and a piece of an ear. See, one of the things, if you were going to claim that this was an animal that was killed by a predator, you better bring back whatever's left over. A couple, what's left over of legs, maybe the piece of an ear, and say, this is all I could find of the sheep. And at least you are exonerated. But most of the time, a thief would come, he'd just take them, and the sheep would disappear. There are those who Jesus calls the thief and the robber. They don't do what God tells them to do. They don't care about the sheep. They care about themselves. The second we read about is the stranger. The stranger's not known by the sheep. In fact, it says the stranger, the sheep will not follow. There's a reason for that. It's interesting that when Jesus talks about some of these things, that in John chapter 10 and verse 5, he gives a little interesting tidbit. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of the stranger. There's an interesting thing that happens. Sheep recognize the pitch, the speed, the rate, and the language of the shepherd. You know, if you do an internet search, there are some instances where shepherds, even today, since places like Scotland or Great Britain and other places, what you find out is they have a call that they make, and the sound of their voice, and the way they do it, and the haunting nature of it. The sheep are gravitated to when they do it. The sheep come running. But if you were to go out as a stranger and say, "Come here, sheep," they'd ignore you because you're not the shepherd. You're the stranger. They don't know who you are. But as soon as a stranger shows up and says, "Here I am," sheep might come because they know him and they know his voice. The third, though, is the hireling. In fact, in John chapter 10 and verse 12, it calls him a hired hand. There were times that the shepherd was not available, so they had to hire someone to tend the sheep. The problem with the hireling is that he doesn't care about the sheep. He cared about his own skin. And for instance, there in John chapter 10 and verse 12, it says, he who is a hired hand and not the shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He has no care about the sheep. He's been paid. They're your sheep. I'm not putting my life at risk for this. So I'm going to do what's in my best interest. I'm going to take care of me. Think about those three images: the thief and robber, the stranger, and the hireling. These are those who care more about themselves than they do the sheep. It was an accusation that God laid heavily on the shoulders of the Jewish leaders after the exile. In Ezekiel chapter 34 rather, Ezekiel is told to prophesy to the leaders of Israel. Remember, the background of this is Babylon has come. They have just absolutely decimated Jerusalem, carried off the people to Babylonian captivity. The temple is gone. The nation seems to be a wreck. How did that happen? How did they lose their moral and spiritual compass so badly that it came to that? Here's what Ezekiel 34 says. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds. He's talking about leaders now here. Thus says the Lord God, ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves, should not the shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourself with the wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. He tells the high priest and his family, and the rest of the priesthood, and the advisors to the king, the prophets, not the true ones, but the false ones. You have fed yourself at the expense of the flock, and you have taken care of you, and now the flock is lost. I always wonder how that rang in the ears of the Jewish leaders. The accusation is fierce. And those are only 3 verses. The rest of the chapter just rips them apart. You don't care about the sheep. You care about your position. You care about your authority. You care about your power. You care about your pay. So Jesus brings all of this into John chapter 10 and says, let me tell you about the good shepherd. He says in verse 7, John 10, so Jesus again said to them, truly I say to you, I am the door to the sheep. Now, there are 2 images that we need to get clear here to understand this. First of all, he says, I am the door to the sheep. That's the first image. Now we say, well, what does that mean? Well, a lot of things, I suppose, but there's something very specific going on here, something that was very cultural, something they understood when he said it. We don't, because we don't have sheep and because we're not in the same situation. But we can still recover that if we understand it. If they are out in the countryside and it begins to be nightfall, you have to care for the sheep and protect them. So many times they would find a rock that had a cleft in it, an opening, and then he would herd the sheep into that opening, and then he would lay in front of the opening to keep the sheep in and to keep wolves and bears out. That was what he did. But if they were back in the regular pasture, which tended to be true, they had a sheepfold. Sheepfold was usually made out of brick, had a thin, narrow slit on one side, usually circular the rest of the way around. That opening was the door. And so when the shepherd would bring the sheep, he would lead them into the sheepfold. They would all go in, and then in that slit, he became the door. He stood there. He laid there. He blocked entrance and exits. And if an animal came, if a predator came, he barred them from entry. One of the things we've read about, it says if you enter without, if you climb over, this is a good image of how they might climb over and lift the sheep out in the middle of the night. But they didn't get there through the gate because somebody's guarding the gate. And that's the shepherd. He's the door. You don't get in without him knowing. You don't get out without him knowing. He's the door. And so it says, I am the door to the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep do not listen to them. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. Jesus was the access point of the kingdom of God. You didn't get into the kingdom any other way but through him. You never found pasture any other way but with him. You never found security any other way except that he gave it to you. He's different. So that one image helps us understand some things, but then Jesus also says in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep. This is an image we tend to think about Jesus the shepherd, with a lamb draped upon his shoulders, carefully taking care of it. I think the good question to ask here is really what makes Jesus the good shepherd. The interesting thing about that term good is it has a couple of different meanings, or there are a couple of different words really that can be rendered good. One is morally good. In other words, they are ethical and they are honest. The only problem is that's not the word John chooses to use for Jesus here. He uses one that says they are attractive because of their character. That's the best way to say it, is this: if you talked about the good doctor, you're not talking about whether he paid his taxes on time. You're talking about his bedside manner. Is he compassionate? Is he caring? Does he heal? Does he care about me? That's all wrapped up in the term that John uses for good. Jesus is the good shepherd. He is the one who has the attractiveness of character to be that kind of shepherd. But what makes him a good shepherd? What gives him that quality? First of all, it's his sacrifice. I am the good shepherd, he says. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now, I want you to think that's not just an idle thing. That's not even just theological. First of all, it says that Jesus voluntarily lays down his life. It is not taken from him. He lays it down. But there's a very vivid image. It is, remember that picture of the sheep pen and that little slit? One of the things that if a beast were to come and try to get to the sheep, he literally would lay his body down in front of him and let the bear tear him alive before he could get to the sheep. Jesus was giving his life, and he ended up giving his life to the enemies of the sheep, so the sheep could be safe and saved. You hear that character come through? That Jesus willingly puts himself in the way for you and I, and he dies so we can live? Very potent picture. The second thing is that he is the good shepherd because of his legitimacy. He has the authority given by someone else to do that. Now, there's a little piece in here that we read through in John chapter 10 and verse 3. We read over and we don't think of it. It says, to him, the shepherd, the gatekeeper opens. The gatekeeper is the owner or the one in charge of the entire flock, and he invests the authority in the shepherd to take care of them. In this image, God is the gatekeeper. It is his fold. It is his sheep. And he has given authority to Jesus to be the shepherd. One small point that Jesus makes that you should never overlook is the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests were not from God. He was. God gave him both right and responsibility and authority to handle this task. And when they would command people, they assumed something that was not theirs. It was not their rules and not their commands, and it's not even their interpretations that make the difference. Jesus is God's representative. But he also knows the sheep. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Shepherds knew who their sheep were. They might say, come here, brown ear. Come here, spindly legs. Come here, waggy tail. They would have these pet names for them because that way they could differentiate the sheep. They knew each sheep. They knew which one was missing. Think about it. If you had 100 sheep, could a shepherd look over them and say, I know who's missing? He could because he knew the sheep. The sheep hear his voice and he can lead them out. It's an interesting concept in all of this that only Jesus really cared about the people of his time and from then on. See, the Pharisees didn't. They were more about their own position and about their own power. Now, they would couch it in terms of, we're concerned about obedience to God. That is a smokescreen. The real thing they were concerned about, and it's sadly true about many leaders in our time as well, is I'm more concerned about making sure I hold on to my power and I maintain my authority than I care about the people. Jesus says, I care about the people because that's who God's flock is. But the last part that makes him the good shepherd is he gives them all they need and more. There is a statement made in John 10 and verse 10 that we usually quote, sometimes out of context, but here's the context. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it in abundance. See, the contrast there is between those who take away things and those who give things. Jesus gives everything that you need, but he doesn't give you just what you need. He gives it in a superabundance. It's just overflowing. In fact, that's what the term tends to be overflowing. Life has an overflowing sense with Jesus. We get what we need. We get sustenance and life. But he also gives us peace and serenity, security, destiny. Jesus gives us more than we need. We are not in survival mode when we follow Jesus. We are in feast mode. So it is that that's there. I want you to think about Jesus gives rather than takes. That's what this passage says. I want you to think back to our lesson in John 9 when the blind man is called before the Pharisees, and when he says, why do you want to know who he is? Do you want to be his disciple as well? They kick him out of the temple. They disenfranchise him. They disfellowship him. They take him out of God's people. And yet Jesus goes out and finds him and brings him in. Who's the shepherd in that story? The one who takes away or the one who gives the most? So the question I want to ask as we're trying to pull these pieces together is, who do you follow? Now that's an important question. Our world today tugs on us and says you need to do this, and we hear discordant voices about what kind of religious system we need to be part of, what do we need to really believe in terms of what's going to get us to heaven or what's going to make us whole or what's going to make us right. There are a lot of things there. Or this guy over here, he has the truth, you need to go listen to him, or this philosophy is working, so all need to get on the bandwagon to that. We're always being asked to follow something. Who do you follow? Here are some questions. Who knows you best? We live in an impersonal world today. If you were to call on the phone and you say, my name's Robert Taylor, they don't care. They say, well, what's your account number? What's your birth date? I know they have to differentiate. Who knows you best? Who knows your hurts? Who knows your cares? Who knows your scars? Most of us have scars that we've never told anybody about. They hurt too much. Jesus knows that. All of it. all of it. He knows you so well. Why wouldn't you follow him? He's the only one. Secondly, who brings you to God? Just as the Pharisees had cast out the blind man, Jesus brings him in. We have a lot of places in the world today that's separating people out into categories that says you're in and you're out. And because you're not part of this group or that group, you're not in. Jesus says, I don't care who you belong to in this world, I can get you to God. Nobody in the world can get you to God like Jesus can. Preachers can't. Teachers can't. I can't do that for you. All I can do is introduce you to someone who can bring you to God. So I'm nothing more than a middleman who can bring you to God. Follow them. Who will sacrifice all for you? You see, most people, they'll give to a certain level. There's a term I hear today that disturbs me in religious circles, and it's infected the church as well. That's a concept called acceptable losses. Oh, well, this is going to make somebody mad, and so we just got to accept that and let them go wherever they want to go. In other words, we care more about ourselves than anybody else. Who's going to lay their life down on the line, even if it costs them everything, for you? Who in your life do you know who will give everything for you? That's important. Jesus does. Who will give you all that you need and even more? We can find various things. We go to a grocery store to get food. We turn on the tap and get water. We don't have the same situation that other people have had over the time. But who's going to give you meaning? Who's going to bring you peace? Who's going to give you heaven? You can buy biscuits, but you can't buy an eternal home. Only Jesus can do that. I am the good shepherd, for I care for my sheep. So as we close, there's one simple idea I want to leave you with. Number one, first of all, is that sheep are led, they're not herded. Jesus leads us. He doesn't force you. He calls you to come follow me. But when you follow someone, they're going to take you somewhere. And you need to ask a question. Is that where you want to go? And if not, don't follow them. Thank you for joining me. We're going to come back next week with the story of the raising of Lazarus. But I'm glad that you joined me today, and I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next Sunday.